Well, thank you very much for joining us for another Q&A at ICMI 21. This is concerning domestic and intimate partner violence. We have my regular co-host, Natalie Powell, and we also have Not a Man, who has appeared in another Q&A and a couple of our videos. Not, do you just want to really quickly just recap your sort of background?
Sure. Probably 16 years of experience with domestic abuse, going back to family of origin. So that's caused me to say, hang on, something's going wrong here. What am I doing wrong? How did I get here? And then starting to gain awareness to say, oh, well, this isn't very good. We're going to have to do something to stop it. And seeing through some of the rhetoric about what domestic and family violence is and comparing it to my own situation, saying, well, I don't quite agree with the rhetoric. Not a Man is an alias for me because I was accused of being not a man by my ex-wife when she was a little bit upset with me. So I decided that I would be, and
Reclaim the term.
Do something to change. Yeah, repossess the term and do something to change things.
And we have a question from Douglas. Douglas says, Natalie is very right in suggesting that one answer, so long as the feminist DV industry is in control, may be to abuse feminism's own nonsense by men claiming themselves as women. Is this something which a victim can do, or is that not really something a victim can do given the emotional state at the time? That's a really good question. Not, do you want to have a go at answering that one?
Sure. I've toyed with this idea quite a lot after calling a number of DV services and saying, well, I'm a victim of DV, could you help me? And seeing the responses, which, let's say, weren't particularly useful for me. I found it was a good idea to play with. I like the creativity and beauty of responding to rhetoric saying, well, now I'm a woman, so please help me. And it's not so much my emotional state at the time, although that certainly didn't help. It was more that because the abuse was centered around me and my identity as a male and a father, to then say, oh, well, now I identify as a woman actually means that I can't get the help that I need as a man. So I'm sure if I said, okay, well, now I identify as a woman, I would get help, but I would probably get the help that they're set up for to help women, which is, okay, well, how about we take you and your child out of this domestically violent situation and shelter you from the perpetrator, except that the minute I did that, the police would receive a complaint that I've abducted my child and was dangerous to them, so it really wouldn't fly. Although I could claim that to the DV services, claiming that to a police officer and director of public prosecutions probably wouldn't wash too well. So I would think that it would need all of the services at the same time to have the same politically correct feminist policies, and they're just not aligned enough for that to be an effective counter response to extreme feminism.
That's a really good point you put about the not being aligned, as you say, that some government departments may well accept your statement, but let's say the police probably wouldn't, perhaps, unless they've got some sort of directive on that. Yeah. What if we found ourselves in a situation where someone could very easily just change their gender by filing a document, which is apparently, it's the case in a number of countries, and apparently in Switzerland at the moment, I've heard recently, it's possible to change your gender by just sort of popping down to a government office and paying some small fee and you get your, and you've now got yourself a new gender. As an aside, apparently a fair number of Swiss men are seriously considering this as a way of getting out of mandatory military duty, because only Swiss males have to do that. So, but if that's the case, and if that would that cause the alignment between the different departments? Would the departments then have to accept your gender if there was if you had a legal document that said, "I am a woman"?
Well, they may. The difficulty is that we don't have DV in a vacuum. We have DV integrated often with parenting and court cases. So if I just imagine doing that, going down and not genuinely identifying as a woman, but saying, oh, well, okay, hey, all right, this is my response to it. I would think that could then be used in court as, well, no, you've declared that you're a woman. Mm. And the child's already got a mum and you want to be another mum. And so, well, why do we need two mums? So I can just see a whole bunch of legal complications there. Saying, well, you can't campaign, you can't demand father's rights if you've signed a document to say that you're a woman now. Yes. You can't say the child is best raised with two different gender models for their healthy development, and then say that you're also a mum. The best you could argue is that, well, a child needs two parents, which sort of weakens the case.
You made some really good points there, actually. Yeah, and so I think you're probably right that even if a man did do this, they may well find that the system still manages to bite him somehow.
The system will always bite him. That was the whole point. It doesn't matter whether you change your gender or you go non-binary. The system's always going to work against the men. And if a man does turn around and go, the only way for me to get help is to change my gender, there's still going to be a million loopholes. For me, as a woman, I can go, oh yeah, so-and-so beat me up. And I'm given, he's the golden footpath. Absolutely. But now I'm going to take out the nuclear family of male and female father. What do happen to non-binary couples, and what do happen to same-sex couples? Are all of these going to be intertwined with a male victim because they don't suit the Duluth model narrative?
So before we go on with that, I just want to note, Douglas made a comment here that there are even online forms to change gender in a couple of countries. So imagine that. You don't even have to go down to the government office anymore. You make a good point, Natalie, talking about same-sex couples, for example. And the Duluth model presumes that domestic and intimate partner violence is really part of patriarchal oppression and so forth. And then what happens when you have a same-sex female couple? And as we know, there are very high levels of intimate partner violence there. And of course, obviously, we know the Duluth model doesn't work, and this is one of the ways that it shows that that's the case. But in court, I think that's especially now with gay marriage having been now in Australia for a few years, the state is going to be having to wrestle with this a lot more. I mean, Australian states accepted gay de facto relationships for a very long time, but I think now that there's actually gay marriage in Australia, I think we'll probably see a lot more court cases like this in the family court, same-sex couples.
Yeah, I think we need some sort of legal precedent, but to get through this, the difficulty is that most people aren't going to be in a position to bring any type of legal precedent, and even if it is, it's in the lower courts and won't be referred to. So we really need something like an ACLU in Australia that will, ideally it should be the Australian Human Rights Commission, but they won't do that. But yeah, we need these sort of things clarified by the courts. And also, just reiterating my previous point, you have so many different pieces of the machine that will have different takes and different biases, all probably generally biased against men, but there are going to be specific implementations of that, which makes it difficult to just pick a position like changing a gender, and that being the solution. I do think also that is in a bit of a way giving ground to say, all right, well, let's just accept that men have no rights and therefore all the men are women. I think it would serve to make a point, but wouldn't actually, maybe by making the point it will sort of cause people's eyes to be opened, but yeah.
More generally in society, I think that the feminists have built up really a gendered narrative for a long time, and really the trans movement has absolutely shaken them to the core, which is why the TERFs, of course, are fighting back. The trans exclusion radical feminists are really fighting back. And so now you've got this conflict between predominantly feminists on one side and the trans movement on the other. And it's something I don't know if any of us would have predicted 5 years ago. But so it's interesting to think about how this affects the court system, or how it affect the court system in domestic violence.
Yeah, I'm just looking at Douglas's follow-up question here. Do you want to read that, Robert?
Sure. Is this an area where an alliance between the MRM and lesbian movement is possible? That would be interesting. I'm happy to jump in on that one if you want, because this is something I've thought about. Then I'll give everyone else a chance to comment too. So this is really interesting. I think that we won't find an alliance between any sort of lesbian movement and the MRM, because there's too much hostility, particularly on their side, unfortunately. I noticed you've said lesbian movement to distinguish it from feminism. My view is that what we have is essentially the feminist movement is being hammered by, as I said, the trans movement, and a lot of things are being achieved that we've wanted to see, and feminism is losing a lot of power, and we're not having to lift a finger to have that happen. So I don't think there'll be any sort of alliance at all, actually, but we're sitting back and as somebody said recently, we're actually eating some popcorn. So now, does anyone else want to comment on Douglas's comment there?
Yeah, I think the extreme feminist movement. So we're not talking about women who genuinely are concerned about equality. We're talking about the let's go out and achieve power for women at the expense of everything else. I do think that movement is destroying itself simply by leaving so many people who would be their allies behind. The last meeting I was in parental alienation, and the feminist movement itself is opposed to recognising that. Now, there's no rational reason why they should be, since men and women are equally perpetrators and victims of that. But that's their political position, which means that a whole bunch of women in distress are just being thrown under the bus by not being recognised, and the male perpetrators not being held to account. And so obviously those women may well have considered themselves feminists, but then when coming across, oh, hang on, I've just been sacrificed for the cause, may not be very happy about that. So I do think that there's going to be a whole bunch of previous allies of the feminist movement falling out, and there is potential to unite those people. I do think that's going to be particularly difficult, because originally they all came from an ideology, and there's no otherwise uniting alternate ideology, except, if you like, the one from the MRM saying, well, hey, you know, not so sure about this patriarchy thing. It's not an alternate theory, really. It's just a, well, I'm not so sure about that theory. So also I know, if we talk about particularly in the area of DV and the lesbian movement, if you have lesbian relationships and those have been affected by DV, then I would suspect that you'll have people with such a level of injury, or quite a significant minority of people with such a level of injury from both men and women, that they're just going to be angry at everybody instead of just angry at males. So I think it's going to be hard to form alliances there.
Yeah, Natalie, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I just think the more people that stand up and say something along the lines like the Duluth model seriously doesn't work because I'm not part of that. Even females who stand up and say that, especially when it comes to non-binary, lesbians and transgender, they aren't part of the Duluth model. And we're talking about a large majority of DV victims would be part of that gap. That's even taken away male victims of domestic violence. No offense. So I think if people start to realize that it's not just male victims that are getting ignored, but it's all these other different communities, maybe, just maybe the government will start to listen and go, okay, so we need a complete overhaul to understand all victims of domestic violence. It is got nothing to do with gender. It's got nothing to do with sexuality. It's got nothing to do with how you identify yourself. It's got to do with being a victim of domestic violence, and find out what we can do for each community that suffers from domestic violence.
In fact, I was going to say too, it tends to tie to things like education level and so forth, where if you have, say, communities where the average education level is lower, you tend to get higher rates of domestic violence and so forth. There are a few other things that people like Erin Pitsey found were correlated, and the government essentially ignores, the Australian government, and I'm sure, absolutely sure, British government, certainly the US government, basically ignores the vast majority of this information. And
I suspect that that's not true.
What, that they don't ignore it? Or?
No, I suspect it's not true that lower levels of socioeconomic status result in higher levels of domestic violence. What I think is true is that it appears that way because of the definitions of domestic violence.
Go on.
Because domestic violence is recognised, let's take a farcical stereotype. Man comes home from work, punches woman in the nose, or rapes her. Okay, right, tick in the box, domestic violence. So that's much more a less sophisticated response that's going to be associated with drug use and excessive alcohol consumption, inability for people to express themselves and resolve problems, which does come with lower levels of education and socioeconomic status. However, in higher levels of education, you'll have very sophisticated, nuanced levels of coercive control, whether by males or females, playing games, psychological games, gaslighting, which is far more difficult for a survey participant to then say, oh yes, domestic violence. For police to be called and say, Yes, I see 8 transactions which could have been financially coercive over the last 3 months looking at the bank statements. That doesn't happen, so it doesn't show up in surveys.
Yeah.
That's what I suspect the reality is. Of course, the statistics will show more poverty, more physical violence. Therefore, poor people are more violent. I'm not so sure.
That's a really good point, actually. Now, Carl, I see you've got a question there. I'm just going to continue along these lines for a little bit and then get back to your question. But Douglas made a comment earlier, which I think is relevant to what you just said. So Douglas said, on the expansion of domestic abuse to financial abuse, in the standard definition put out from the UN, strictly speaking, even stopping your partner from spending money on illegal drugs is domestic abuse. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit, perhaps, is the expansion of the definition of domestic violence, which you did touch on there. Perhaps it makes sense for coercive control to be included, but the question is, should things like financial control, how far do we go with that? That could be a form of coercive control, but it could also be an attempt to save the family's finances, for example. And there are some other things that the definition is expanded as well. So I don't know. Don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, yeah. Cynically speaking, I think domestic violence is defined as whatever the people in power want to define it as. Obviously, there are things that are very, very clearly violent. Rape, stabbing, murder, infanticide. Nobody's arguing that those things are not domestic violence. Physical assault in any form. But it's when we start looking at the expansion of well, what is it? I mentioned in a previous Zoom meeting that me claiming to be a victim of domestic violence publicly is considered by the police to be domestic violence. Yeah. Me saying, no, I would like to have a conversation about parenting my child and not accepting, not talking about this at all, ever. Me failing to accept that and continuing to insist on the topic being addressed is apparently me being domestically violent. That sounds like a very convenient shifting of definitions to the definition being whatever is convenient. I would love to see very, very clear, defined behaviours considered domestic violence. Even if you refuse this reasonable financial request under the circumstances 8 times in the last 6 months, then you are guilty of financial coercive control, otherwise you're not. Stuff like that.
Some sort of quantification.
Yeah, rather than, hey, just anybody's idea, and if they don't like you and you're the wrong gender, then you're guilty.
So along the lines of this, Douglas has made a comment I want to actually expand on before we get onto the new questions, but along the lines of expansion of the definition of domestic and intimate partner violence, interestingly enough, some feminist organisations have argued denying sex is actually a form of intimate partner violence. But what's really interesting here is it's only true when the man does it, of course.
Oh, yeah. And so although that's happened to me, obviously that doesn't count.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
No, I was just a horny guy who, needs to suck it up.
Yep.
I'm sorry, I just had a strange thought in my head.
Yes.
So if I go out tonight and try and pick up a guy for a quick one-night stand and he knocks me back,
you can try that on with the police. It'd probably work the way things are going. Yep. Sorry, that's satirical, but I wasn't serious.
But it's still reality.
Yeah. So Douglas said there are, I am told, a growing number of anti-feminist lesbians. Now this was a comment in relation to something we were talking about just a moment ago. I saw that comment after we sort of talked about the topic, but I did want to jump back to it because there are within the men's rights movement a number of lesbians today. Not many, I must admit, but there are a number. And I think you're absolutely right. The number of anti-feminist lesbians is actually growing. Yes, It's probably still a small minority, I suspect, but it is growing. And I do personally know a number of them.
Yeah, I do think there are growing numbers of ex-feminists who realise the truth about the ideology where the rubber really hits the road, and say, hey, hang on, this isn't what I was promised when I was sold this idea. Hey, hang on, that's not right. and the systemic answer being, oh yes, it is.
I mean, we often talk about women realizing how bad things are when they get a new partner and the new partner is completely destroyed by the system. But another case that can even touch on lesbians is, and there have been a few cases where it's been the brother that's been destroyed, and that's opened their eyes. So that even though they don't have a male partner, they've got a brother they love, and the brother gets destroyed by the system, and then they realize what's really going on.
Yeah.
So Carl's got a question. Are you aware of the Achieving Change Through Values-Based Behaviour, ACTV program that is an alternative to the Duluth model? No, I'm actually not aware of that. Whenever I see a new program come up, I worry that it's feminist derived. So I don't know if you've got any thoughts there, Carl, if you want to give us any input on whether you believe that this is a genuine program that might be a better alternative to Duluth, or is it just more of the same? Anyone else has it? Not, or Natalie, have you aware of that program?
I haven't heard of it.
I haven't heard of it either, but using a bit of cynicism and a bit of experience, achieving change through values-based behaviour, it sounds very suspiciously like a let's change the way that you see the world. And obviously, if the way that you see the world is not officially correct, then we'll change it. Of course, at face value, all for it. You know, values-based behaviour, yeah, absolutely. Hopefully, on paper, we all have the same values. It's just what our values really are, and how we really behave is a different question.
I think Not makes a good point that I think the name probably to me makes me a little suspicious, but I will look into it after this, probably after ICMI now, but this is the last day. But I will look into it. I'll put something up on Wiki for Men actually, whether even if I'm happy with it or not, we can definitely put something up on Wiki for Men.
Okay. So Carl has just posted in the chat here, Achieving Change Through Values-Based Behaviour, ACTV program was developed in 1994, is based heavily on the principles of acceptance commitment therapy, ACT, and was developed to fit the structure of court-mandated programs. While the Duluth model is based on feminism, ACTV focuses on teaching people to choose behaviour that's consistent with their values, even in the presence of anger, thoughts, and urges to act in a violent way. Look, it sounds really good to me, notwithstanding the fact that it's fitting the court-mandated programs, which is almost certainly going to be based on the assumption that that person is male, so therefore violent and therefore needs to be changed. But actually, in my personal experience just now, I've been required to attend a psychotherapist in order to change my view of the lying cow ex who lies to the court, so that my view is in line with feminist thinking, and I consider her a wonderful parent looking after the best interests of my child.
You're experiencing wrong think, aren't you? Yes.
Yes. So surprisingly, though, I was forced to choose a particular psychologist, and that particular psychologist has massive amounts of experience in male behaviour change programs, except that I get along with him like a house on fire because he is not ideological. He just happens to have that experience. And so we have great chats. But that's accidental. It's accidental. It wasn't the intention of the court. So I'm very open to a required program or a court fitting in with official court structures, which actually happens to accidentally be really good and healthy and constructive.
No, thank you very much. And Douglas has just said, have a look at the PDF I posted above. That was developed by DABS in the UK, Canada, which is for equality care in DV. Yeah. So thank you very much for that. We can see, I'll look at putting that link on Wiki for Men as well, actually, to preserve it. Now, we do have a question from Douglas. In the UK now, following the Istanbul Convention, a single instance of shouting at your partner is domestic abuse. Where is the suitable line between ordinary occasional snappiness and what you would consider domestic abuse? How can this be legally defined? Does it need to be, or is it just a matter for therapists, not the judiciary? That's a great question. Not going to put you on the spot.
I think we need to focus on where does the line between private behaviour, between individuals in a private relationship come to the attention of external authorities and law. So there are many people in a relationship. I mean, I think it was the day before yesterday, I shouted at my housemate and said, just shut the fuck up. Now, okay, that, according to this definition, is domestic violence. And okay, I can see the argument for that. The difficulty is that you're just considering one behaviour in complete isolation. Firstly, if there's just a measure, is that measure only able to measure one particular type of behaviour, but be completely unable to measure the other causal behaviour? The second is anybody going to complain about it? So there might be a whole bunch of behaviour which both parties consider, oh, look, you know, you're just in a crappy mood at the moment. No big deal. No, I'm not going to go to the police, and neither are you, because, look, you know, what's that going to help? Unless we want to score points against each other, and that's not going to help either. So I think we're only talking about when either party is motivated to bring behaviour to the attention of external parties for any legal definition to make any sense at all. Otherwise, it might just be bumping somebody in the shoulder as you pass the corridor, and yeah, it might be malicious, but you know, once we get into legal definitions, then it's, well, are we going to only take this behaviour and ignore the other behaviour? Yeah, I do think these things do need to be legally defined, but we need to be very careful about categorising one thing which crosses one arbitrary line as illegal behaviour while ignoring the other thing, which is less visible. I know from my own childhood, my own behaviour as at times a bit of a brat, that, and looking at my sister, that I as a male always tend to be blatantly obvious when I was doing something wrong. There was never any question about whether I did it. It was just so transparently visible. My sister, on the other hand, could get away with a whole bunch of stuff because she was more sneaky. Yeah, interesting.
So I think that question actually, and what you were saying, also touches back on what you were saying earlier, which is quantitative or having more accurate criteria for assessment, which is something that's certainly lacking in the system at the moment. And I know a lot of it's inherently subjective, but nevertheless, I think you're on a good argument there when you suggest that we may be able to nail it down a little bit more and provide some more concrete examples and more concrete guidance.
Another problem is if we're talking about legal definitions and the involvement of the judiciary, the evidence gathering process itself is frequently seen as domestic violence. So attempting to prove that somebody is a victim by, let's say, audio recording, well, that's intimidating. So therefore, by trying to prove that you're a victim, you're a perpetrator. And that could actually probably go both ways. You know, the woman saying, hey, you know, he's abusing me all the time. I'm going to audio record him on my phone. And then the male could then, you know, we're assuming that he is actually the primary perpetrator here. The male could then say, hey, she's intimidating me by recording my every move. How am I meant to live a reasonable life?
The police would probably be less inclined to listen to him if he said that, though, I would imagine.
Yes, but it's still a valid legal argument.
Make it through the system.
Yeah, so I think we're getting to a point where we're just pointing at shadows in every single type of behaviour as, oh, that's domestically violent. And it just goes on forever.
Yeah.
He did that, she did that. They're both domestically violent. And so it's basically, oh, so if you're a normal human being and you act in a normal human way, regardless of male or female, you could, according to one particular set of opinions, always be guilty of domestic violence towards the other. So everybody's guilty, which isn't a useful way to address the problem.
That's right. There's an old saying, if everything is domestic violence, applying to domestic violence, if everything is domestic violence, then nothing is domestic violence. If we continue to extend the definition, as we have been doing, as you suggest, increasingly normal human behaviours will be domestic violence. And that is, of course, what we're seeing with affirmative consent in places like New South Wales too. A little bit off topic there, but we're talking about what would once have been considered perfectly normal human behaviours are increasingly at risk of being criminalised. So Carl Palmer has a comment. As a counsellor, I used the principles of the ACTV program, that's the program you mentioned earlier, when I worked alongside males and females who had been arrested for assault. So I'm definitely going to look into this program, and I'm wondering, did we not use it in Australia? Because I've also, a long time ago, admittedly, when I served as a police officer, and I don't remember encountering a program like that. It may, but New Zealand and Australia tend to do things in a fairly similar way. So the fact you've got it in New Zealand would suggest maybe it's in some parts of Australia. I don't know, but it's not something I've come across. But I will definitely be looking into it, and I'll definitely put up a Wiki for Men page, regardless of sort of what background information I find.
Yeah, it sounds really good.
It sounds like you liked it, Carl, which is a good sign. And Douglas says, coming back to the point, to the doubt that not raised on socioeconomic grouping, I have been looking up in PASC and find that it largely backs up what he said. In there, at a glance, all I could find is psychological victimization among women is significantly associated with poorer occupational functioning and social functioning. Yes, yeah, thanks. Carl said he's going to contact me about that. That's fabulous. Thank you. Yes, so Douglas makes a good point there, actually. So there's a few aspects going on there, as we know. There's the expanded definition, whether people of a higher socioeconomic level are either more able to hide it or are engaging in more subtle behaviours. So I think actually that would probably be, in all honesty, a discussion all on its own. And probably actually, if we something we should maybe look at in the future, maybe in the tackle box or something, or a future ICMI as well. I think that's an area that would be interesting to delve into.
Yeah, it possibly sustain less injury and are more able to cope with those injuries as well if they're at a higher socioeconomic status, whether due to being able to navigate the system themselves or seek help appropriately, have more financial resources to address, and less likely to fall down into the snowball effects of homelessness and mental health problems and drug addictions.
Yeah.
So I suspect that the behaviour is just better masked. Different behaviours causing significant injury, but easier to recover, and so therefore assumed that it's only a problem for poor people. I think it's just recognised and more recognisable as a problem for lower socioeconomic status.
One area in particular I was thinking of was an inability to diffuse conflict through alternative methods correlating with education level, which then correlated with socioeconomic level. But perhaps that's a bit of a stretch. And as you do say, there's a chance that it's just more subtle in other situations.
Yeah, it's going to be a big feedback loop. But just because somebody's educated and able to resolve problems through alternative means doesn't mean that they do.
Fair point. Yes. And there's links to alcoholism and so forth. So
Yeah.
that's true. And let's see, do we have any more questions from our audience? We have a few minutes left, but it's probably, if we don't have any more questions, this is probably a fair place to wrap up, actually. So can I just put out there any final questions from our audience? Otherwise, I think we'll call it a day. I think we've had a really good discussion there, actually, and it's given me some thoughts about areas to really talk about and look into down the road. So Douglas has just said, ask a man, do you suffer from domestic abuse? And he'll often say no. Ask the same man, do you get nagged at, screamed at? Or do you ever feel you have to do something at home that you would rather not do? And he's likely to say yes, that's right. Which does also touch back to when does it become domestic or intimate partner violence? When does it become coercive control beyond just nagging? Maybe there's situations where maybe he doesn't want to do something, but it really should be done, and it's a family responsibility. So it comes back to what you're talking about there, not about where we draw the line.
Yeah, it also comes back to the public opinion and everybody's individual opinion for what do they consider domestic violence. So Douglas's comment there, do you suffer from domestic abuse? That's assuming that the person knows exactly what domestic abuse is. Even if there's a perfect definition legally, that doesn't mean everybody knows what it is. Yeah. They know what it is by public service advertisements, which show a man screaming at a woman. So therefore, have you screamed at a woman, or has a woman screamed at you? Well, that doesn't fit the picture of the public education campaign. So therefore, no, he's not a victim.
Yeah.
But there are, we talked about withholding sex before. You know, do you have to beg and plead and grovel and be on your best behaviour for days and days and days in order to have sex, which is meant to unite a relationship? Oh, yes, but you're not a victim of DV. Well, no. Okay, because it's only when men do that is it DV. So it's about public recognition of the definitions.
So you mentioned there about something, I mean, I'm sure it is true in many countries, and I do look at the situation overseas, but obviously a lot of what I've been looking at is in Australia. But the public campaigns, as Not says, are very much, if you go into police stations or so forth, or courthouses, there'll be pictures of men standing over women with the hand raised, and that's the picture of domestic violence. The New South Wales Police Force, so state police force here, ran a campaign of a variety of scenarios in their campaign talking about domestic violence a few years ago, and they had a bunch of pictures of men being violent towards women, and we called them out on that, and they admitted fault, mea culpa, they said, and they ran another campaign where they included images of women being violent towards men, and they were absolutely hammered by the feminists as a result of that. And I really think New South Wales Police were actually quite shocked at what happened. To their credit, they did run a campaign which at least attempted to be a little non-gendered, and they absolutely got hammered. So whereas we had sort of just campaigned and said, why don't you include violent women in that? And they said, yes, okay. Then they were absolutely hammered by the feminists, which of course shows what happens.
So now they've learnt to behave themselves.
Yes, exactly. And they have. And all the recent campaigns seem to be very gendered again, as far as I can see. So looks like we're about at the end of our time. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Not, for coming along. Thank you to all of our attendees. We are closing in on the end of the conference. Bye-bye, everyone.
Yeah.
Okay.